was intentional, but the man had smelled surprised and pleased when he realized what he had done. So Perrin was still walking through grayness when he reached the bottom of a ridge, where all of the high-wheeled carts stood in a line with horses hitched. The dim figures of Carianan cart drivers moved about them, checking harness, tightening the ropes that held the canvas covers on. Massima was waiting, and Perrin wanted nothing so much as to chew off the man's arm, but he spotted the stout shape of Basil Gill beside one of the carts and headed that way. Linny was with him, wrapped in a dark cloak, and Brianna with her arm around the waist of Lambquin, Perrin's hulking manservant. Master Gill snatched off his brimmed hat to reveal thin graying hair combed back over a bald spot that it failed to cover. Linny sniffed and pointedly avoided looking at Perrin while pretending to adjust her cowl. She smelled of anger and fear. Master Gill just smelled of fear. "It's time for you to start north, Master Gill," Perrin said. "When you reach the mountains, follow them until you strike the Johanna road. With luck, we'll catch you up before you reach the mountains, but if not, send Aleandra's servants off to Johanna, then you head east through the pass, then north again. We'll be as close behind you as we can." If his plan did not go too far awry, liked he was a blacksmith, not a soldier. But even Ty Lee had finally agreed it was a good plan. "I will not leave this spot until I know that Megden is safe," then he told the fog, her thin voice a reed of iron. "And the Lady Fail, of course." Master Gill rubbed a hand back over his head. "My lord, Lamgwin and I were thinking maybe we could help out. The Lady Fail means a great deal to us, and Megden is one of our own. I know one end of a sword from the other, and so does Lamgwin." He was wearing one belted around his bulk, yet if he had handled a sword these past 20 years, Perrin would eat the whole great length of that belt. Brianna's grip on Lamgwin tightened, but the big man patted her shoulder and rested his other hand on the hilt of a short sword. The fog obscured his scarred face and ankles. He was a tavern brawler, though a good man even so, but never a swordsman. "You're my Shambayan, Master Gill," Perrin said firmly. "It's your duty to get the cart drivers and grooms and servants to safety. Yours and Lamgwin's. Now go on with you and see to it." The stout man nodded reluctantly. Brianna breathed a small sigh of relief when Lamgwin knuckled his forehead in acquiescence. Perrin doubted that Lamgwin could have heard the sigh, though the man put his arm around her and murmured comforting words. Linny was not so compliant. Back stiff as a rod, she addressed the fog again. "I will not leave this spot until I know—" Perrin slapped his hands together with a loud crack, startling her into looking at him in surprise. "All you can do here is catch the ague from standing in the damp. That and die if the Shido manage to break through. I'll bring Fail out. I'll bring Megden and the others out." He would, or die himself in the attempt. There was no point saying that, though, and reason not to. They had to believe in their bones that he would be following with Fail and the rest. "And you are going north, Linny. Fail will be upset with me if I let anything happen to you. Master Gill, you make sure she rides with you if you have to tie her up and put her in the back of a cart." Master Gill jerked, crumpling his hat between his hands. He smelled of alarm suddenly, and Linny of pure indignation. Amusement filled Lamgwin's scent, and he rubbed at his nose as though concealing a smile, but strangely, Brianna was indignant too. Well, he had never claimed to understand women. If he could not understand the woman he was married to, which he could not half the time, then it was unlikely he ever would understand the rest of them. In the end, Linny actually climbed up beside the driver of a cart without having to be forced, though she slapped away Master Gill's hand when he tried to assist her, and the line of carts began to trundle off northward through the fog. Behind one of the carts, laden with the Wise One's tents and possessions, marched a cluster of white-clad Gaishain, meek even now, men and women with their cowls up and their eyes lowered. They were Shido, taken at Cairhien, and in a few months they would put off white and return to their clan. Perrin had had them watched discreetly, despite the Wise One's assurances that they would adhere to Giotto in this regard, whatever others they abandoned, yet it appeared the Wise Ones were right. They still numbered 17. None had tried to run off and warn the Shaido beyond the ridge. The cart's axles had been greased liberally, but they still creaked and squealed to his ears. With luck, he and Fail would catch up to them, shy of the mountains. As the strings of spare mounts began to pass him, on long leads held by mounted grooms, a maiden appeared in the mist, coming down the line of carts. Slowly, she resolved into Sulin, shufa around her neck to bear her short white hair, and black veil hanging down onto her chest. A fresh slash across her left cheek would add another scar to her face unless she accepted healing from one of the sisters. She might not. Maidens seemed to have odd attitudes about Wise One's apprentices, or maybe it was just that these apprentices were Aes Sedai. They even saw Anura as an apprentice, though she was not. The Shaido sentries to the north are dead, Paranebar, she said, and the men who are going out to replace them. They danced well for Shaido. You took casualties? He asked quietly. Alienda and Brienne woke from their dream. She might have been speaking of the weather rather than 2 deaths among women she knew. We all must wake eventually. We had to carry Aviellan the last 2 miles. She will need healing. So, she would accept it. I'll send the Aes Sedai with you, he said, looking around in the fog. Aside from the line of horses passing him, he could see nothing. As soon as I can find one. They found him almost as he spoke. Anura and Masuri striding out of the fog, leading their horses, with Berelain and Masema, his shaven head glistening damply. Even in the mist, there was no mistaking the rumpled nature of the man's brown coat or the crude darn on the shoulder. None of the gold his followers looted stuck to his hands. It all went to the poor. That was the only good that could be said of Masema. But then a fair number of the poor that gold went to feed had been made poor by having their possessions stolen and their shops or farms burned by Masema's people. For some reason, Berelain was wearing the coronet of the first of Mayenne this morning, the golden hawk in flight above her brow, though her riding dress and cloak were plain dark gray. Beneath her light, flowery perfume, her scent was patience and anxiety, as odd a combination as Perrin had ever smelled. The 6 wise ones were with them too, dark shawls draped over their arms, folded kerchiefs around their temples, holding back their long hair. With all their necklaces and bracelets of gold and ivory, they made Berelain appear simply dressed for once. Aram was one of their number as well, the wolf-head pommel of his sword rising above one red-striped shoulder, and the fog could not hide the absence of his habitual glower. The man gravitated toward Masema and seemed almost to bask in some light that Masema gave off. Perrin wondered whether he should have sent Aram with the carts, but if he had, he was sure Aram would have leaped off and sneaked back as soon as he was out of Perrin's sight. He explained Aviellan's need to the 2 Aes Sedai, but to his surprise, when Masuri said she would come, fair-haired Adara raised a hand that stopped the slim brown in her tracks. Anura shifted uncomfortably. She was no apprentice, and uneasy over Seonad and Masuri's relationship with the Wise Ones. They tried to include her in it, and sometimes succeeded. Janina will see to it, Adara said. She has more skill than you, Masuri Sakawa. Masuri's mouth tightened, but she kept silent. The Wise Ones were quite capable of switching an apprentice for speaking up at the wrong time, even if she did happen to be an Aes Sedai. Sulin led Janina, a flaxen-haired woman who never seemed to be ruffled by anything, off into the fog, Janina striding as quickly as Sulin despite her bulky skirts. So the Wise Ones had learned healing, had they? That might be useful later in the day. The light said it was not needed often. Watching the pair disappear into the murk, Masema grunted. The thick mist hid the ever-burning intensity of his deep-set eyes and obscured the triangular white scar on his cheek, but his scent was full in Perrin's nose, hard and sharp as a freshly stropped razor, yet twitching in a frenzy. That smell of madness sometimes made him think his nose must bleed from breathing it. Bad enough you use these blasphemous women, who do what only the Lord Dragon, blessed be his name, may do, Masema said, his voice full of the heat that the fog concealed in his eyes. The colors spinning in Perrin's head turned into a brief image of Rand and Min, and a tall man in a black coat, an Ashaman, and he felt a shock right down to his boots. Rand's left hand was gone. No matter. Whatever had happened, and today his business lay elsewhere. But if they know healing, Masema continued, it will be that much harder to kill the savages. A pity you won't let the Seanchan leash all of them. His sidelong glance at Anura and Masuri said he included them, despite the fact both had visited him in secret more than once. They regarded him with Aes Sedai calm, though Masuri's slim hands moved once as if to smooth her brown skirts. She said she had changed her mind and now believed the man must be killed, so why was she meeting him? Why was Anura? Why did Masema allow them? He more than hated Aes Sedai. Perhaps answers could be found now that Javier and Marian no longer needed protection. Behind Masema, the wise ones stirred. Fire-haired Garel, who looked as if she possessed a temper, though she did not, actually stroked the hilt of her belt knife. And Navarin, who could have given Nynaeve lessons in getting angry, gripped hers. Masema should have felt those eyes boring into his back, but his scent never shifted. Insane he might be, but never a coward. You wanted to speak to Lord Perrin, my Lord Prophet? Berylane said gently, though Perrin could smell the strain of her smile. Masema stared at her. I am simply the prophet of the Lord Dragon, not a lord. The Lord Dragon is the only lord now. His coming has shattered all bonds and destroyed all titles. Kings and queens, lords and ladies are but dust beneath his feet. Those whirling hues threatened again, but Perrin crushed them. What are you doing here? He demanded. There was no way to soften moments with Masema. The man was as hard as a good file. You're supposed to be with your men. You risked being seen by coming here, and you'll risk it again going back. I don't trust your people to hold for 5 minutes without you there to stiffen their spines. They'll run as soon as they see the Shaido coming their way. They are not my people, Ebara. They are the Lord Dragon's people. Light being around Masema meant having to stomp on those colors every few minutes. I left Nengar in charge. He has fought more battles than you have dreamed of, including against the savages. I also gave the women orders to kill any man who tries to run, and have let it be known that I will hunt down anyone who escapes the women. They will hold to the last man, Ebara. You sound as if you're not going back, Perrin said. I intend to stay close to you. Fog might hide the heat in Masema's eyes, but Perrin could feel it. A pity if any misfortune should befall you just as you reclaim your wife. So, a small part of his plan had unraveled already. A hope, really, rather than part of the plan. If all else went well, the Shaido who managed to flee would carve a way through Masema's people without more than slowing a step. But instead of taking a Shaido spear through his ribs, Masema would be keeping an eye on him. Without any doubt, the man's bodyguard was not far off in the fog, 200 or so ruffians better armed and better mounted than the rest of his army. Perrin did not look at Berylane, but the scent of her worry had strengthened. Masema had reason to want both of them dead. He would warn Galen that his primary task today would be protecting Berylane from Masema's men, and he would have to watch his own back. Off in the fog, a brief flash of silver-blue light appeared, and he frowned. It was too early yet for Grady. 2 figures coalesced out of the mist. One was Niald, not strutting for once. In fact, he stumbled. His face looked tired. Burn him, why was he wasting his strength this way? The other was a young Seanchan in lacquered armor with a single thin plume on the peculiar helmet he carried beneath his arm. Perrin recognized him. Guaya Araba, a lieutenant Ali thought well of. The 2 Aes Sedai gathered their skirts as if to keep him from brushing against them, though he went nowhere near them. For his part, he missed a step when he came close enough to make out their faces, and Perrin heard him swallow hard. He smelled skittish of a sudden. Araba's bow included Perrin and Berylane, and he frowned slightly at Masema as though wondering what such a ragged fellow was doing in their company. Masema sneered, and the Seanchan's free hand drifted toward his sword hilt before he stopped it. They seemed touchy folk, Seanchan did, but Araba did not waste time. Banner General Kirgan's compliments, my lord, my lady first. Murat Rakan report those bands of Aiel are moving faster than expected. They will arrive sometime today, possibly as soon as noon. The group to the west is perhaps 25 or 30,000, the one to the east larger by a third. About half of them are wearing white, and there will be children, of course, but that is still a lot of spears to have behind you. The Banner General wishes to know if you would like to discuss altering the deployments. She suggests moving a few thousand of the Altaran Lancers to join you. Perrin grimaced. There would be at least 3,000 or 4,000 Algad Siswai with each of those bands. A lot of spears to have at his back for certain sure. Niald yawned. How are you feeling, Niald? Oh, I'm ready to do whatever needs doing. I am, my lord, the man said, with just a hint of his usual jauntiness. Perrin shook his head. The Ashaman could not be asked to make one gateway more than necessary. He prayed that they would not fall one short. By noon, we'll be done here. Tell the Banner General we go ahead as planned. And pray that nothing else went amiss. He did not add that aloud, though. Out in the fog, wolves howled, an eerie cry that rose all around Malden. It was truly begun now.
You're doing wonderfully, Magden, Fael croaked. She felt lightheaded, and her throat was dry from encouraging the woman. Everyone's throat was dry. By the slant of the light coming through the gaps overhead, it was near mid-morning, and they'd been talking without cease for most of that. They had tried tapping the unbroken barrels, but the wine inside was too rancid even for wetting lips. Now they were taking turns with the encouragement. She was sitting alongside her sun-haired maid, while the others rested against the back wall, as far from that leaning jumble of boards and timbers as they could get. You're going to save us, Magden. Above them, the red scarf was just visible through that narrow gap in the tangle. It had hung limply for some time now, except when the breeze caught it. Magden stared at it fixedly. Her dirty face glistened with sweat, and she breathed as if she had been running hard. Suddenly the scarf went taut and began to swing once, twice, 3 times. Then the breeze sent it fluttering and it fell. Magden continued to stare. That was beautiful, Fael said hoarsely. The other woman was getting tired. More time was passing between each success, and the successes were lasting a shorter time. It was abruptly a face appeared beside the scarf, one hand gripping the length of red. For a moment she thought she must be imagining it. Aravine's face, framed by her white cowl. I see her, the woman said excitedly. I see the Lady Fael and Magden. They're alive. Voices raised a cheer, quickly stilled. Magden swayed as if she might fall over, but a beautiful smile wreathed her face. Fael heard weeping behind her and wanted to weep with joy herself. Friends had found them, not Shido. They might escape yet. Pushing herself to her feet, she moved closer to the leaning pile of charred rubble. She tried to work moisture into her mouth, but it was thick. We're all alive, she managed in a husky voice. How in the light did you find us? It was Therill, my lady, Aravine replied. The scamp followed you despite your orders, and the light bless him for it. He saw Galena leave and the building fall in, and he thought you were dead. He sat down and cried. A voice protested in rough Amadisian accent, and Aravine turned her head for a moment. I know someone who's been crying when I see him, boy. You just be thankful you stopped to cry. When he saw the scarf move, my lady, he came running for help. You tell him there's no shame in tears, Fael said. Tell him I've seen my husband cry when tears were called for. My lady, Aravine said hesitantly. He said Galena pulled on a timber when she came out. It was set like a lever, he said. He said she made the building collapse. Why would she do that? Aleandra demanded. She had helped Magden to her feet and half supported her to reach Fael's side. Lasil and Arala joined them, alternating between tears and laughter. Aleandra's face was a thunderhead. Fael grimaced. How often in the last few hours had she wished she had that slap back? Galena had promised. Could the woman be Black Ajah? That doesn't matter now. One way or another, I'll see her repaid. How was another matter. Galena was Aes Sedai, after all. Aravine, how many people did you bring? Can you... Large hands took Aravine by the shoulders and moved her aside. Enough talk. Roland's face appeared in the gap, shufa around his neck and veil hanging onto his chest. Roland! We cannot clear anything with you standing there, Fail Bashir. This thing may fall in when we start. Go to the other end and huddle against the far wall. What are you doing here? She demanded. The man chuckled. He chuckled. You still wear white, woman. Do as you are told, or when I have you out of there, I will smack your bottom soundly. And then maybe we will soothe your tears with a kissing game. She showed him her teeth, hoping he did not take it for a grin. But he was right about them needing to move away, so she led her companions across the board-strewn stone floor to the far end of the basement, where they crouched against the wall. She could hear voices muttering outside, likely discussing exactly how to go about clearing a path without making the rest of the building collapse on her head. All this for nothing, Alejandra said bitterly. How many Shido do you suppose are up there? Wood scraped loudly, and with a groan, the leaning pile of rubble leaned inward a little more. The voices began again. I haven't any idea, Fail told her. But they must all be Meriden, not Shido. The Shido did not mingle with the brotherless. There might be some hope in that. Surely Roland would let her go once he learned about Dirain. Of course he would. And if he remained stubborn, in that case she would do whatever was necessary to convince him. Perrin would never have to find out. Wood scraped on wood again, and once more the heap of burned timbers and boards tilted inward a little further.
The fog hid the sun, but Perrin estimated it must be near mid-morning. Grady would be coming soon. He should have been there by now, if the man had grown too tired to make another gateway. No, Grady would come, soon. But his shoulders were as tight as if he had been working a forge for a full day and longer. I tell you, I don't like this one bit, Galen muttered. In the thick mist, his red eye patch was just another shadow. His heavy-chested bay nosed his back, impatient to be moving, and he patted the animal's neck absently. If Masima really wants to kill the lady first, I say we finish him now. We outnumber him. We can overwhelm his bodyguard in minutes. Fool, Arganda growled, glancing off to his right as if he could see Masima and his men through the curling grayness. Unlike the Mayener, he had put on his silvered helmet with its 3 fat white plumes. It and his breastplate, worked in gold and silver, glistened with condensation. Fog or no fog, his armor seemed almost to glow. You think we can kill 200 men without making a sound? Shouts will be heard the other side of this ridge. You have your ruler where you can surround her with 900 men and maybe get her away. Alejandra is still in that bloody town and surrounded by Shido. Galen bristled, hand going to his sword hilt as though he might practice on Arganda before moving on to Masima. We're not killing anybody but Shido today, Darren said firmly. Galen grunted, but he did not try to argue. He stank of discontent, though. Protecting Berylane would keep the winged guards out of the fighting. Off to the left, a bluish flash appeared, dimmed by the thick mist, and the tightness in Perrin's shoulders loosened. Grady appeared in the fog, peering about him. His step picked up when he saw Perrin, but it was unsteady. Another man was with him, leading a tall, dark horse. Perrin smiled for the first time in a long while. It's good to see you, Tam, he said. Good to see you too, my lord. Tam Althor was still a blocky man who looked ready to work from sunup to sundown without slacking. But the hair on his head had gone completely gray since Perrin had seen him last, and he had a few more lines on his bluff face. He took in Arganda and Galen with a steady gaze. Fancy armor did not impress him. How are you holding up, Grady? Perrin asked. I'm holding up, my lord. The weathered man's voice sounded bone-weary. Shadowed by the fog as it was, his face still looked older than Tam's. Well, as soon as you're done here, join Mishima. I want somebody keeping an eye on him. Somebody who makes him too nervous to think they can change what they agreed to. He would have liked to tell Grady to tie off this gateway. It would make a short path to take Fail back to the Two Rivers. But if things went wrong today, it would make a short path for the Shido, too. Don't know as I could make a cat nervous right now, my lord, but I'll do what I can. Frowning, Tam watched Grady vanish into the gray murk. I could wish I'd had some other way to get here, he said. Fellows like him visited the Two Rivers a while back. One called himself Mesrim Taim, a name we'd all heard. A false dragon, only now he wears a black coat with fancy embroidery and calls himself the Mahale. They talked everywhere about teaching men to channel, about this Black Tower. He traded the words with silence. The village councils tried to put a stop to it, and the women's circles, but they ended up taking about 40 men and boys with them. Thank the light some listened to sense. I think they'd have had 10 times that. His gaze shifted to Perrin. Taim said Rand sent him. He said Rand is the dragon reborn. There was a touch of questioning in that, perhaps a hope for denial, perhaps a demand to know why Perrin had kept silent. Those hues whirled in Perrin's head, but he batted them away and answered by not answering. What was, was. Nothing to be done about it now, Tam. According to Grady and Niall, the Black Tower did not just let men go once they signed on. Sadness entered Tam's scent, though he let nothing show on his face. He knew the fate of men who could channel. Grady and Niall claimed the male half of the source was clean now, but Perrin could not see how that could be. What was, was. You did the job you were given, followed the road you had to follow, and that was that. There was no point complaining about blisters or rocks underfoot. Perrin went on. This is Bertin Galen, Lord Captain of the Winged Guards, and Gerard Arganda, First Captain of the Legion of the Wall. Arganda shrugged uncomfortably. That name carried political weight in Gillidan, and apparently Alejandra had not felt strong enough to announce that she was reconstituting the Legion. Bulwer had a nose for sniffing out secrets, though. This one made sure Arganda would not go wild trying to reach his queen. Galen, Arganda, this is Tam Althor. He's my first captain. You studied the map, Tam, and my plan? I studied them, my lord, Tam said dryly. Of course he would have. It looks a good plan to me. As good as any till the arrows start flying. Arganda put a booted foot in his roan's stirrup. So long as he's your first captain, my lord, I have no objections. He had offered plenty earlier. Neither he nor Galen had been pleased that Perrin was putting someone over them. From up the slope came a black-winged martyr's shrill cry of alarm. Only one. If it had been a real bird, the call would have been repeated. Perrin scrambled up the slope as fast as he could. Arganda and Galen passed him on their mounts, but they divided to ride to their men, disappearing into the thick gray haze. Perrin continued to the top and beyond. Daniel was standing almost at the edge of the fog, peering toward the Shido encampment. He pointed, but the reason for the alarm was obvious. A large group of Elgaid Siswai was leaving the tents, maybe 400 or more. The Shido sent out raiding parties frequently, but this one was aimed straight at Perrin. They were just walking, but it would not take them long to reach the ridge. It's time to let them see us, Daniel, he said, unpinning his cloak and draping it over a low bush. He would come back for it later, if he could. It would only get in his way now. Daniel sketched a bow before hurrying back into the trees as Aram appeared, sword already in hand. He smelled eager. The cloak pin Perrin put into his pocket carefully. Fail had given him that. He did not want to lose it. His fingers found the leather cord he had knotted for every day of her captivity. Pulling it out, he let it fall to the ground without glancing at it. This morning had seen the last knot. Tucking his thumbs behind the wide belt that supported his hammer and belt knife, he strolled out of the fog. Aram advanced up on his toes, already in one of those sword stances. Perrin just walked. The morning sun, indeed halfway to its noon peak, was in his eyes. He had considered taking the eastern ridge and putting Massima's men here, but it would have meant that much further to reach the town gates. A foolish reason, yet those gates drew him as a lodestone drew iron filings. He eased his heavy hammer in its loop on his belt, eased his belt knife. That had a blade as long as his hand. The appearance of two men, apparently walking idly toward them, was enough to halt the Shido. Well, perhaps not so idly, considering Aram's sword. They would have to be blind to miss the sun glinting off his long blade. They must have been wondering whether they were watching madmen. Halfway down the slope, he stopped. Relax, he told Aram. You're going to tire yourself out that way. The other man nodded without taking his eyes from the Shido and planted his feet firmly. His scent was that of a hunter after dangerous quarry and determined to pull it down. After a moment, half a dozen of the Shido started toward them, slowly. They had not veiled. Likely they were hoping he and Aram would not be frightened into running. Among the tents, people were pointing at the two fools on the slope. The sound of running boots and hooves and snorting horses made him look over his shoulder. Arganda's Gildanan appeared out of the fog first, in their burnished breastplates and helmets, riding behind the rippling red banner that bore the 3 six-pointed silver stars of Gillidan, and then the winged guards in their red armor behind the Golden Hawk on a field of blue of Mayenne. Between them, Daniel began arraying the 2 rivers men in 3 ranks. Every man carried a pair of bristling quivers at his belt and also a bundle of shafts that he stuck point down into the slope before slicing the binding cords. They wore their swords and short swords, but the halberds and other pole arms had been left on the carts this morning. One of them had brought along the red wolf-head banner, but the staff was stuck aslant into the ground behind them. No one could be spared to carry the thing. Daniel carried a bow too. Massima and his bodyguard of lancers took position on the winged guard's right, their poorly handled horses plunging and rearing. Their armor showed patches of speckled brown where rust had been scraped away instead of properly cleaned. Massima himself was out in front, a sword at his hip, but helmetless and without a breastplate. No, he did not lack courage. He was glaring at the Mayenners, where Perrin could just make out Berylane in the middle of that forest of lances. He could not get a clear view of her face, but he imagined it was still frosty. She had objected strenuously to her soldiers being held back from the fighting, and he had needed to be very firm to make her see reason. Like the woman had half suggested, she might lead them in a charge. The wise ones and the 2 Aes Sedai filed down between the Gildanan and the 2 rivers men, accompanied by the maidens, each of whom had long strips of red cloth tied around her upper arms and dangling to the wrist. He could not pick out Auntie Ellen, but by their number she must be among them, newly healed or not. Black veils covered their faces except for their eyes, yet he did not need to see their faces or catch their scents to know they were indignant. The markings were necessary to avoid accidents, but Idara had to put her foot down to make them wear the things. Bracelets of gold and ivory rattled as Idara adjusted her dark shawl. With smooth, sun-dark cheeks that seemed darker because of her pale yellow hair, she looked little older than Perrin, but her blue eyes held an unshakable calm. He suspected she was far older than she appeared. Those eyes had seen a great deal. "I think it will begin soon, Perrin Aybara," she said. Perrin nodded. The gates called to him. The appearance of near enough 2,000 lancers and 200-odd bowmen was sufficient to make the Shido below raise their veils and spread out, while more began rushing from the tents to join them in a thick, lengthening line. Pointing fingers along that line, pointing spears, made him look back again. Tam was on the slope now, and more 2 Rivers men were pouring out of the fog with longbows in hand. Some tried to mingle with the men who had followed Perrin, to reunite with brothers, sons, nephews, friends, but Tam chivied them away, trotting his black gelding up and down as he arranged them in 3 ever-expanding ranks, to either side of the horsemen. Perrin spotted Hugh Barron and his equally lanky brother Tad, the stableman from the Wine Spring Inn, and square-faced Bar Gautry, only a few years older than he himself was, who was making a name for himself as cabinet maker. and skinny Thad Torfin, who seldom left his farm except to come into Emmons Field. Orrin Dowtree, lean and tall, stood between Johnny Ellen, who was hulking and bald, and Kev Barsteer, who finally had gotten out from under his mother's thumb if he was here. There were Marwins and Aldeas, Alcines and Coles, Thanes and Alcars and Craws, men from every family he knew, men he did not recognize, from down to Devon Ride or up to Watch Hill or Terran Ferry, all grim-faced and burdened with pairs of bristling quivers and extra sheaves of arrows. And among them stood others, men with coppery skins, men with transparent veils across the lower half of their faces, fair-skinned men who just did not have the look of the Two Rivers. They carried shorter bows, of course. It took a lifetime to learn the Two Rivers longbow, but every face he could make out looked as determined as any Two Rivers man. What in the light were the Outlanders doing here? On and on the streams of running men continued until finally those three long lines held at least 3,000 men, maybe 4. Tam walked his horse down the slope to Perrin and sat studying the swelling Shido ranks below, yet he seemed to hear Perrin's unspoken question. I asked for volunteers from the Two Rivers men and picked the best bow shots, but those you took in started coming forward in groups. You gave them and their families homes, and they said they were Two Rivers men too now. Some of those bows won't carry much more than 200 paces, but the men I chose hit what they aim at. Below, the Shido began beating their spears rhythmically against their bullhide bucklers. Rat-tat-tat-tat, rat-tat-tat-tat, rat-tat-tat-tat. The sound rose like thunder. The flow of veiled shapes running out from the tents slowed to a trickle, then dwindled further, and then ceased. All of the Algaid Siswai had been drawn out, it seemed. That was the plan, after all. There must have been 20,000 of them, near enough, all pounding their bucklers. Rat-tat-tat-tat, rat-tat-tat-tat, rat-tat-tat-tat. After the Aiel War, I hoped never to hear that again, Tam said loudly to be heard. That noise could get on a man's nerves. Will you give the command, Lord Perrin? You do it. Perrin eased his hammer again, his belt knife. His eyes kept going from the Shido to the town gates, and the dark mass of the fortress inside the town. Fail was in there. Soon now we will know, Adara said. About the tea, she meant. If they had not waited long enough, they were all dead. Her voice was calm, though. Aram shifted, up on his toes again, sword upright before him in both hands. Perrin could hear Tam calling as he rode along the lines of bowmen. Longbows, knock. Short bows, hold till you're close. Longbows, knock. Short bows, hold till you're close. Don't draw, you fool, you know better. Longbows. Below, perhaps a quarter of the Shido turned and began trotting north, paralleling the ridge, still beating their bucklers. Another quarter began trotting south. They intended to sweep around and catch the men on the slope from either side. Flanking, Tidy called it. A ripple passed through those remaining as they began sticking their spears through the harness holding their bow cases, hanging their bucklers on their belts, unlimbering their bows. Very soon, Idara murmured. A fireball larger than a man's head arched out from the tents toward the ridge, then another twice the size, and more, streams of them. Sailing high, the first turned down, and exploded with loud roars 100 paces overhead. In rapid succession, the others began exploding harmlessly too, but more followed. Spheres of flame speeding toward the ridge in a continuous flow. Forked silver lightning stabbed down from a cloudless sky and erupted with booming crashes of thunder and great showers of sparks, without ever coming near the ground. Perhaps 15 or 20 wise ones escaped the tea, Adara said. Otherwise, more would have joined in by now. I can see only 9 women channeling. The rest must be among the tents. She disliked the agreement he had with the Shonchan almost as much as the Aes Sedai did, yet her voice was calm. In her book, the Shido had violated Jiato to such a degree that it was questionable whether they could be called Aiel any longer. To her, they were something that had to be cut out of the body of the Aiel, and their wise ones were the worst of the sickness for allowing it. Masuri drew her arm back, but Idara laid a hand on her shoulder. Not yet, Masuri Sakawa. We will tell you when. Masuri nodded obediently, though she smelled of impatience. Well, I, for one, feel in danger, Anura said, drawing her arm back. Idara looked at her levelly. After a moment, the Aes Sedai lowered her arm. Her beaded braids clicked together as she twisted her head away from the Wise One's stare. Her scent was of strong unease. Perhaps I can wait a little longer, she muttered. The fireballs hurtling across the sky continued to explode far above. The lightning jabbed toward the ridge, but the Shaido below were not waiting. With a shout, the main mass began trotting quickly toward the ridge, and singing at the tops of their lungs. Perrin doubted anyone else on the slope could make out more than a roar, but his ears caught words faintly. They were singing in parts. Wash the spears while the sun climbs high. Wash the spears while the sun falls low. Wash the spears, who fears to die? Wash the spears, no one I know. He shut the sound out, ignoring it, while his eyes drifted beyond the onrushing mass of veiled figures to the gates of Malden. Iron filings to a lodestone. The shapes below seemed to have slowed half a step, though he knew they had not. Everything seemed to slow down for him at times like this. How long before they came in range? They had covered little more than half the distance to the ridge. Longbows raise, on my signal, Tam shouted. Longbows raise, on my signal. Perrin shook his head. It was too soon. Thousands of bowstrings snapped behind him. Arrows arced over his head. The sky seemed black with them. Seconds later, another flight followed, then a third. Fireballs burned swaths through them, but it was still thousands of arrows that fell in a deadly hail onto the Shaido. Of course. He had forgotten to factor in the bowman's elevation. That gave them a little more distance. Trust Tam to see it right away. Not every arrow struck a man, of course. Many plunged into the ground. Perhaps half struck Algaid Siswai, piercing arms or legs, striking bodies. Wounded Shaido hardly slowed, even when they had to struggle up from the ground. They left hundreds lying still, though, and the second flight put down hundreds more, as did the third, with the fourth and fifth already on the way. The Shaido kept coming, leaning forward as if trotting into a driving rain, while their wise ones' balls of fire and lightnings exploded far overhead. They were no longer singing. Some raised their bows and shot. An arrow grazed Perrin's left arm, but the rest fell short. Not by far, though. Another 20 paces, and the sudden sharp sound of Seanchan horns pulled his gaze north and south just in time to see the ground erupt in fountains of fire among the flanking parties. Spears of lightning stabbed into them. The Damani were being kept back in the trees for the time, but they did deadly work. Again and again, explosions of fire or lightning hurled men like twigs. Those Algaid Siswai could have no idea where the attack was coming from. They began to run toward the trees, toward their killers. Some of the fireballs coming out of the camp began flying toward the forests where the Damani were, and lightnings jabbed toward the trees, but with as little effect as they had against the ridge. Ty Lee claimed Damani were used for all sorts of tasks, but the truth was they were weapons of war, and they and the Sul'dam were very good at it. Now, Idara said, and fireballs began raining down on the Shaido below. The Wise Ones and Aes Sedai made throwing motions with both arms as fast as they could, and every time a bowl of flame seemed to rise from their fingertips. Many of those exploded too soon, of course. The Shaido Wise Ones had to defend their own, but the Algaid Siswai were much nearer to the ridge, so they had less time to react. Fireballs burst among the Shaido, hurling men aside, flinging severed arms and legs into the air. Silver-blue lightning bolts forked down, and most of those struck too. The hair on Perrin's arms stirred. The hair on his head tried to stand. The air seemed to crackle with the lightning's discharges. Even as they flung death at the men below, Idara and the others continued to parry the Shaido Wise Ones' attacks, and all the while the Two Rivers men worked their bows as fast as they could. A trained man could loose 12 shafts in a minute, and the range was shorter now. The Shido lacked no more than 200 paces of reaching the bottom of the ridge. Their arrows still fell short of Perrin, but the Two Rivers arrows were striking home every time at this range. Each bowman was picking his own target, of course, so Perrin saw Agaid Siswai fall pierced by 2, 3, even 4 shafts. Flesh could only take so much. The Shido began to fall back. It was not a rout. They did not flee. Many shot arrows back at the ridge despite no hope of making the range. But they turned as if on a command and ran, trying to outpace the Two Rivers shafts and the rain of fire and lightning that pursued them. The flankers were falling back too, as lancers appeared out of the trees, forming ranks 1,000 horses wide, advancing slowly while fire and lightning harried the Shido. "By ranks!" Tam shouted. "Advance 3 paces and loose!" "Advance at a walk!" Arganda bellowed. "With me!" Massima shouted. Perrin was supposed to take that slow advance with the others, but he began to walk down the slope faster and faster. The gates tugged at him. His blood was becoming fire. Elias claimed it was a natural feeling when you were in danger of your life, but he could not see it. He had almost drowned in the waterwood once, and he had felt nothing like this thrill that was surging through him now. Someone behind shouted his name, but he trotted on, picking up speed. Freeing his hammer from its belt loop, he drew his belt knife with his left hand. Aram was running beside him, he realized, but his own focus was on the gates, on the Shido who still stood between him and Fail. Fire, lightning, and arrows fell among them like hail, and they were no longer turning to fire their own arrows. They often looked over their shoulders. Men who dragged a load side with the Two Rivers shaft, and he was catching up. Half a dozen veiled men turned back, gripping spears, and started toward him and Aram at a run, not using their bows nor their arrows. Tales of champions, of men who decided the future by single combat between 2 armies that would abide by the outcome. The Aiel had no such tales. He did not slow down, though. His blood was fire. He was fire. A Two Rivers shaft took one Shido in the middle of his chest, and even as he fell, 3 more were feathered with at least a dozen arrows each. But now he and Aram were too close to the remaining 2. Anyone but the very best bow shots would risk hitting him or Aram if he fired. Toward one of the Shido as if dancing, his blade a bright blur, but Perrin had no time to watch anyone else fight if he had wanted to. A veiled man who overtopped him by a head stabbed at him with a short spear held near its base. Blocking the spear with his belt knife, Perrin swung his hammer. The Shido tried to stop it with his knife, but he altered the swing slightly. The bones in the man's forearm snapped under 10 pounds of steel swung by a blacksmith's arm. He was inside the spear now, and without slowing, he slashed across the man's throat with his knife. Blood gouted, and he was running again while the man was falling. He had to reach Fail. Fire in his blood, fire in his heart, fire in his head. No one and nothing would keep him from Fail.
Chapter 30. Outside the Gates. Fail tried to estimate the time by the slant of light falling through the gaps in the ruined building overhead. It seemed still short of noon. All that had been cleared was a small space at the very top of the basement stairs. Any of them could have passed through it if they dared to try climbing the slanting pile of blackened rubble, but that still looked as though it might fall in any moment. The tangled heap still creaked alarmingly at times. The only good thing was that it had not started raining on their heads. How long that would last was a question. She had been hearing thunder for some time, quite a lot of it, and slowly coming closer. The booms were almost continuous. A storm that fierce might be enough to make the building finish collapsing. Light, she was thirsty. Roland suddenly appeared in the opening and lay down on the stone landing. He was not wearing the harness that held his bow case. Carefully he wriggled his way out onto the rubble. The pile groaned softly under his weight. Kinwin, a green-eyed man a good hand or more shorter than he, knelt to grip his ankles. There were only 3 of the brotherless up there, it seemed, but that was 3 too many. Head and shoulders sticking over the edge of the rubble, Roland lowered one arm. "There is no more time, Fail Bashir. Take my hand." "Magdin first," Fail said thickly, waving away the sun-haired woman's weary protests. Light, but her mouth was coated with grit. and too dry to spit any of it out. Arla and Lucille next. I'll go last. Aleandra nodded approvingly, but Arla and Lucille tried to object too. Be quiet and do as I say, she told them firmly. Thunder crashed and crashed. The storm that produced that much thunder would bring a deluge, not simple rainfall. Roland laughed. How could the man laugh at a time like this? He only stopped when the charred timbers beneath him groaned again from his shaking. You still wear white, woman, so be quiet and do as I say. There was a touch of mocking in his tone at that, but not when he added, no one will be taken out before you. That sounded like cast iron. My lady, Aleandra said quietly, hoarsely, I believe he means it. I will send the others out in the order you gave. Stop pouting and give me your hand, Roland commanded. She was not pouting. The man could be as infuriatingly stubborn as her Perrin. Only in Perrin it was intriguing, not really infuriating. Raising her right hand as high as it would go, she let Roland's hand envelop hers. He lifted her easily till her face was just below his. Catch hold of my coat. There was no hint of strain in his voice, despite the awkward angle of his arm. You will have to climb over me. She swung her left hand up and caught a fistful of the rough wool, holding on hard. The pain in her shoulder told her it was bruised as badly as she feared. When he released her other hand, she gasped at the jolt of agony and quickly grabbed his coat with that one, too. Grasping her waist in both hands, he boosted her higher, so she was lying on his broad back. Thunder boomed and boomed without ceasing. The rain must start falling soon. That would make getting the others out more difficult. I like feeling your weight on me, Fail Bashir, but maybe you could climb a little faster so I can bring the others out. He pinched her bottom, and she laughed in spite of herself. The man just would not stop trying. The climb over him was slower than she could have hoped for. She did not believe anything was broken in her shoulder, but it hurt. Once she thought she kicked Roland in the head. Pinch her, would he? At last she was outside and past Kinwin, on her feet under the sky once more. Her first sight of the building from outside made her swallow and then cough vigorously as bits of grit entered her throat. The charred timbers were tilting to an alarming degree, ready to crash into the basement. The third brotherless, Joradin, a blue-eyed man with red-gold hair and a face that fell not far short of prettiness, was watching Kinwin and Roland, but every so often he glanced at the building as if expecting to see it fall. He was squat for an Aiel, not quite as tall as Perrin, but half again as wide. There must have been at least 100 of her people in the street, staring at her anxiously, some of their white robes stained with soot from their efforts at digging her out. 100. She could not find it in her heart to upbraid them, however, especially after Aravine thrust a plump waterskin into her hands. The first mouthful went to wash away grit and dust, though she wanted desperately to swallow it anyway, but after that she held up the skin and all but poured water down her throat. Her bruised shoulder protested. She ignored it and drank and drank. Suddenly she became aware of lightning striking outside the town to the west and lowered the waterskin to stare, close outside the town, out of a cloudless sky, and sometimes not striking. Many of those forked silvery bolts erupted with thunderous roars far above the ground. Balls of fire hurtled across the sky, sometimes bursting in air with a boom like thunder. Someone was fighting a battle with the power. But who? Could Perrin have found enough Aes Sedai or Ashaman to attack the camp? But something was very odd. She knew how many wise ones in the camp could channel, and there did not seem to be enough lightning or fireballs. Perhaps it was not Perrin after all. There were factions among the wise ones, not just between those supporting or opposing Savannah, but between sects with old alliances or animosities. Maybe one of those factions was fighting another. That seemed highly unlikely, but less so than Perrin finding enough Aes Sedai to attack, and the wise ones not fighting back with everything they could muster. When the lightning started, Roland said there was a battle, Aravine said when Fail asked her. That's all. Nobody wanted to go find out more until we knew you were safe. Fail ground her teeth in frustration. Even if she did not have to deal with Roland, Whatever was going on outside the walls might make escaping that much more difficult. If only she knew what it was, she might be able to see how to avoid it, or use it. No one is to go anywhere, Aravine. It might be dangerous, and they might inadvertently lead Shido back when they returned. Light, what was going on? Magden staggered out past Kinwin, rubbing her hip. He pinched me. Her voice was thick, but indignation came through. Fail felt a stab of jealous. Certainly not that. The bloody man could pinch any woman he wanted to. He was not Perrin. Grimacing, she handed the sun-haired woman the water skin, and Magden washed out her mouth hurriedly before beginning to gulp thirstily. She was not so sun-haired at the moment, her curls all sweat-matted and as coated with dust as her sweaty face. She was not even pretty at the moment. Arola came out of the ruin, rubbing her bottom and looking grim as death, but she eagerly took the water skin that Alden offered. The tall young Amadisian, a square-shouldered fellow who looked more a soldier than the bookkeeper he was, gazed at her avidly as she drank. Arola did not like men that way, but Alden refused to accept that he could not convince her to marry him. Lucille appeared, rubbing her bottom, and Joradin handed her another water skin, drawing a finger down her dirty cheek. She smiled up at him before beginning to drink. Already preparing her way back into his blankets, if Roland proved obstinate. At least, Fail thought that she was doing. At last, Leandra stalked past, and if she was not rubbing herself, her expression of frosty ire told the tale plainly enough. Kinwin backed out of the opening and stayed while Roland began working his way across the dangerous pile of fire. My lady, Aravine called anxiously, and Fail turned to find the plump-faced woman kneeling on the paving stones and lifting Magden's lap. Magden's eyelids fluttered, but never came more than half open. Her lips moved weakly, but only mumbles emerged. What happened? Fail said, hurrying to kneel beside them. I don't know, my lady. She was drinking as if she intended to empty the skin, and suddenly she staggered. The next thing I knew, she just collapsed. Aravine's hands fluttered like falling leaves. She must be very tired, Fail said, smoothing her maid's hair and trying not to think of how they were to get to the camp if she could not walk. It would be done if they had to carry her. Light, she felt a touch wobbly herself. She saved us, Aravine. The Amadisian woman nodded gravely. I will hide you somewhere safe until tonight, Roland said, fastening the buckles of his bowcase harness. His brown shufa was already wrapped around his head. Then I will take you to the forest. Taking 3 short spears from Joradin, he thrust them up through the harness behind, so the long spear points, glinting in the sun, stuck up above his head. Fail almost collapsed beside Magden with relief. There would be no need to conceal anything from Perrin, but she could not afford weakness, not now. Our supplies, she began, and as if the sound of her voice were the last straw, the building wheeling groan and fell in with a crash that drowned out the explosions for a moment. I will see that you have what you need, Roland told her, raising the black veil across his face. Joradin handed him another spear and his buckler, which he hung on his belt knife before seizing her right arm and drawing her to her feet. We must move quickly. I do not know who we are dancing the spears with, but the Meradin will dance today. Alden, will you carry Magden? Was all she managed to get out, before Roland strode away, pulling her with him. She looked over her shoulder to see Alden lifting a limp Magden in his arms. Joradin had Lucille by her arm. Roland had her. The 3 brotherless were leading a parade of white-garbed men and women, and one boy. Cheryl wore a grim expression. Fumbling in her sleeve, no easy matter with Roland's big hand on her arm, she closed her fingers around the ridged hilt of her dagger. With anything happening outside the walls, she might have need of that blade before nightfall.
Perrin ran along the winding street. No one moved in his sight, but through the roar of exploding fireballs and lightnings he could hear other sounds of battle. Steel clashing on steel, men shouting as they killed or died, men screaming. Blood ran down the left side of his face from a gash in his scalp, and he could feel it oozing down his right side from where a spear had grazed him, oozing down his left thigh from a spear that had bitten deeper. Not all of the blood on him was his own. The face appeared at the opening to a low, dark tent and drew back hurriedly. A child's face, and frightened. Not the first he had seen. The Shido were being pressed so hard that a good many children had been left behind. That would be a problem for later, though. Over the tents, he could see the gates little more than 100 paces ahead. Beyond them lay the fortress and Fail. Two veiled Shido darted out from beside a dirty brown wall tent, spears at the ready. But not for him. They were looking at something off to the left. Without slowing, he ran into them. Both were larger than he, but the force of his rush carried them all to the ground, and he fell already fighting. The hammer smashed into the bottom of one man's chin, while he stabbed and stabbed at the other man, blade biting deep. The hammer rose and crushed the first man's face, splashing blood, rose and fell again while he stabbed. The man with the ruined face twitched once as Perrin rose. The other lay staring at the sky. A hint of motion at the corner of his left eye made him throw himself to the right. A sword whisked through the air where his neck would have been. Aram's sword. The one-time tinker had taken wounds too. Blood coated half his face on a strange mask. There were blood-wet rents in his red-striped coat, and his eyes looked almost glazed, like those of a corpse. But he still seemed to be dancing with that blade in his hands. His scent was the scent of death, a death he sought. "Have you gone mad?" Perrin growled. Steel rang against steel as he blocked that sword away with the head of his hammer. "What are you doing?" He blocked another slice of the blade, tried to grapple the other man, and barely danced back in time to get away with only a gash across his ribs. "The Prophet explained it to me." Aram sounded in a daze, yet his sword moved with liquid ease, blows barely diverted with hammer or belt knife as Perrin backed away. All he could do was hope he did not trip over a tent rope or come up against a tent. "Your eyes. You're really Shadow Spawn. It was you who brought the Trollocs to the Two Rivers. He explained it all. Those eyes. I should have known the first time I saw you. You and Elias with those Shadow Spawn eyes. I have to rescue the Lady Fail from you." Perrin gathered himself. He could not keep moving 10 pounds of steel as quickly as Aram moved a sword that weighed a third of that. Somehow, he had to get close, get beyond that blade blurring with the speed of its motion. He could not do so without getting cut, and likely badly. But if he waited much longer, the man was going to kill him. Something caught his heel, and he staggered backward, nearly falling. Aram darted in, sword chopping down. Suddenly he stiffened, eyes going wide, and the blade dropped from his hands. He toppled forward to lie on his face, 2 arrows jutting from his back. 30 paces beyond him, a pair of veiled Shido already had arrows knocked and drawn again. Perrin leaped sideways behind a green, peaked tent, rolling to his feet quickly. At the corner of the tent, an arrow was poking through the canvas, still quivering. Crouching, he made his way past the green tent, and then a faded blue one, a low tent of dingy brown, hammer in one hand, knife in the other. This was not the first time he had played this game today. Cautiously, he peeked around the edge of the brown tent. The 2 Shido were nowhere to be seen. They might be stalking him in turn, or off hunting someone else already. The game had turned both ways before. He could see Aram lying where he had fallen. A scrap of breeze ruffled the dark fletchings on the arrow, sticking up from his back. Elias had been right. He should never have let Aram pick up that sword. He should have sent him away with the carts, or made him go back to the Tinkers. So many things he should have done. Too late now. The gates called to him. He glanced over his shoulder. So close now. Still crouching, he began to run again along those twisting streets, wary of those 2 Shido and any others that might be lurking. The sounds of battle were ahead of him now, coming from north and south, but that did not mean there would be no stragglers. Rounding a corner only a few paces from the wide-open gates, he found them filled with people. Most were garbed in dirty white robes, but 3 were veiled Algaid Siswai, one of them a hulking fellow who would have dwarfed Lamgwin. That one had Fail's arm in his fist. She looked as if she had been rolled in the dirt. With a roar, Perrin rushed forward, raising his hammer. The huge man flung Fail back and ran toward him, spear coming up as he plucked his buckler from his belt.
Perrin!
Fail screamed. The big Shido seemed to hesitate for a heartbeat, and Perrin took advantage of it. His hammer hit the side of the man's head so hard that his feet left the ground as he fell. Another was right behind him, though, spear ready to stab. Suddenly the man grunted, surprise in the green eyes above his black veil, and dropped to his knees, peering over his shoulder at Fail, who stood close. Slowly he fell forward, revealing a ridged steel hilt rising from his back. Perrin looked hastily for the third and found him also lying on his face, with 2 wooden knife hilts sticking out of his back. Lucille was leaning against Arella, weeping. No doubt she had found actually killing someone not so easy as she had supposed. Alejandro was at the front of the crowd too, and Megden right behind her, carried by a tall young man in white, but Perrin had eyes only for Fail. Letting knife and hammer fall, he stepped over the dead men and gathered her in his arms. The smell of her filled his nose. It filled his head. She smelled strongly of charred wood, of all things, but he could still smell her. "I've dreamed of this moment so long," he breathed. "I have too," she said against his chest, hugging him hard. Her scent was full of joy, but she was trembling. "Did they hurt you?" he asked gently. "No, no, Perrin. They didn't hurt me." There were other smells mixed in with her joy, though, laced through it inextricably. The dull, aching scent of sadness and the greasy aroma of guilt. Shame, like thousands of hair-fine needles pricking. Well, the man was dead, and the woman had the right to keep her secrets if she wanted. "All that matters is that you're alive and we're together again," he told her. "That's all that matters in the world." "All that matters," she agreed, hugging him even harder. Hard enough that she actually groaned with the effort. But the next instant she had pushed back and was examining his wounds, fingering open tears in his coat to look at them. "These don't look too bad," she said briskly, though all of those emotions still lay tangled in her joy. She reached up to part his hair and tugged until he bent his head so she could examine the slash along his scalp. "You'll need healing, of course. How many Aes Sedai did you bring? How did you—" "No, that's of no matter right now. There are enough of them to defeat the Shido, and that's what's important." "This lot of Shido," he said, straightening to look down at her. Like dirt or no dirt, she was beautiful. "There'll be another 6,000 or 7,000 spears here in—" He glanced at the sun. It seemed it should be higher. "Less than 2 hours, maybe. We need to finish up here and be moving before then if we can. What's wrong with Megden?" She was limp as a feather pillow against the young man's chest. Her eyelids were fluttering without opening fully. "She tired herself out saving our lives," Fail said, abandoning his injuries and turning to the other people in white. "Aravane, all of you, start gathering up Gaishain. Not just those sworn to me. Everybody in white. We leave no one we can reach behind. Perrin, what direction is safest?" "North," he told her. "North is safe." "Start them moving north," Fail went on. "Gather carts, wagons, pack horses, and load them with whatever you think we'll need. Hurry!" People started moving, running. "No, you stay here, Alden. Megden still needs to be carried. You stay too, Alejandra. And Arella. Lucille needs a shoulder to cry on for a while." Perrin grinned. Put his wife down in the middle of a house engulfed in flames, and she would calmly set about putting the fire out. She would put it out, too. Bending, he cleaned his belt knife on the green-eyed man's coat before sheathing it. His hammer needed a good wiping, too. He tried not to think about what he was smearing on the man's coat. The fire was fading from his blood. There was no thrill remaining, only tiredness. His wounds were beginning to throb. "Will you send someone to the fortress to let Ban and Siona know they can come out now?" he said as he slipped the hammer's haft back through the loop on his belt. Fail stared at him in amazement. "They're in the fortress? How? Why?" "Alice didn't tell you?" He'd always been slow to anger until Fail was taken. Now he felt fury bubbling up in him. Bubbles like white-hot iron. "She said she was taking you with her when she left. But she promised to tell you to go to the fortress when you saw fog on the ridges and heard wolves howl by daylight. I'd swear she said it straight out. Burn me, you can't trust Aes Sedai an inch. Fail glanced toward the western ridge, where the fog still clung thickly, and grimaced. Not Alice, Perrin. Galena. If that wasn't a lie, too. It has to be her. And she has to be Black Aja. Oh, how I wish I knew her real name. She moved her left arm and winced. She had been hurt. Perrin found himself wanting to kill the big Shido all over again. Fael did not let her injury slow her, though. Beryl, come out from there. I see you peeking around the gate. A skinny young man edged shyly around the corner of the gate. My father told me to stay and keep an eye on you, my lady, he said, in an accent so rough that Perrin could barely understand. That's as may be, Fael said firmly. But you run to the fortress as fast as you can and tell whoever you find there that Lord Perrin says they're to come. Run! Now! The boy knuckled his forehead and ran. In a quarter of an hour or so, he reappeared, still running, followed by Sioned and Ban and all the others. Ban made a leg to Fael and murmured smoothly how pleased he was to see her again before ordering the Two Rivers men to set up a guard ring around the gate, bows at the ready and halberds stuck in the ground. He used his normal voice for that. He was another who was trying to acquire polish. Salanda and Fael's other hangers-on rushed around her, all babbling with excitement and saying how worried they had been when she failed to appear after the wolves howled. I'm going to Mosseri, Kirkland announced in tones that dared challenge. He did not wait for one, though, simply drawing his sword and running off along the wall to the north. Talonvor gave a cry when he saw Megden being held by the tall young man, and had to be convinced that she was only exhausted. He still took her away from the fellow, and held her against his own chest, whispering to her. Where is Chiad? Gaul demanded. On learning that she had never been with them, he lifted the veil across his face. The maidens tricked me, he said grimly, but I will find her before them. Perrin caught his arm. There are a lot of men out there who'll take you for a Shido. I have to find her first, Perrin Aybara. There was something in the Aiel's voice, something in his scent that Perrin could only call heartache. He understood the sorrow of thinking the woman you loved might be lost to you forever. He let go of Gaul's sleeve, and the man darted through the line of bowmen, spear and buckler in hand. I'll go with him, Elias grinned. Maybe I can keep him out of trouble. Drawing the long knife that had given him his name among the wolves, Longtooth, he went running after the tall Aielman. If the two of them could not make their way safely out there, then no one could. If you are done jabbering, perhaps you will stand still for healing, Sioned told Perrin. You look as if you need it. Furin and Terrell were healing her, hands on their sword hilts and eyes trying to watch in every direction. The ring of Two Rivers men were all very well, their attitude seemed to say, but Sioned's safety was their charge. They looked like leopards healing a house cat. Only she was no house cat. See to Fael first, he said. Her arm is hurt. Fael was talking with Alejandra, both of them so angry they should have had tails to bristle. No doubt angry over Alice or Galena, or whatever her name was. I do not see her bleeding like a stuffed pig. Sioned lifted her hands to cup his head, and that too familiar chill hit him, like suddenly being immersed in a winter pond on the brink of freezing. He gasped and jerked, arms flailing out of his control. When she released him, his wounds were gone, if not the blood smeared on his face and staining his coat and breeches. He also felt he could eat a whole deer by himself. What was that? The diminutive Gring turned away from him toward Fael. Did you mention Galena Kazban? I don't know her last name, Fael said. A round-faced Aes Sedai with a plump mouth and black hair and big eyes. Pretty in a way, but an unpleasant woman. Do you know her? I think she must be Black Aja. Sioned stiffened, hands knotting in her skirts. That sounds like Galena. A red, and decidedly unpleasant. But why would you make such an accusation? It is not a charge to bring against a sister lightly, even against one as disagreeable as Galena. As Fail explained, beginning with the first meeting with Galena, Perrin's anger grew again. The woman had blackmailed her, threatened her, lied to her, then tried to murder her. His fists clenched so tight that his arms shook. "I'll break her neck when I get my hands on it," he growled when she fell silent. "That is not your right," Seonet said sharply. "Galena must be tried before three sisters sitting as a court, and for this charge they must be sitters. The entire hall of the tower might sit for it. If she is found guilty, she will be stilled and executed, but justice in this lies with Aes Sedai." "If," he said incredulously. "You heard what Fail said? Can you have any doubt?" He must have looked threatening because Fern and Taro glided in to flank Seonet, their hands resting lightly on sword hilts, their eyes hard on his face. "She's right, Perrin," Fail said gently. "When Jack Coplin and Len Conger were accused of stealing a cow, you knew they were thieves, but you made Master Thane prove they had stolen it before you let the village council have them strapped. It's just as important with Galena. The village council wouldn't have strapped them without a trial, whatever I'd said," he muttered. Fail laughed. She laughed. Light, it was good to hear again. "Oh, all right. Galena belongs to the Aes Sedai. But if they don't take care of her, I will if I ever find her again. I don't like people hurting you." Seonet sniffed at him, her scent disapproving. "Your arm is injured, milady?" "See to Arella first, please," Fail said. The Aes Sedai rolled her eyes in exasperation and took Fail's head between her hands. Fail shivered and exhaled, hardly more than a heavy sigh. Not a bad injury, then, and gone now in any case. She thanked Seonet while leading her to Arella. Suddenly Perrin realized he could not hear the explosions any longer. In fact, he could not recall hearing one for some time. That had to be good. "I need to find out what's happening. Ban, you keep a close guard on Fail." Fail protested his going alone, and by the time he finally agreed to take 10 of the Two Rivers men, a rider in lacquered armor had appeared, rounding the northern corner of the town wall. 3 thin blue plumes marked her as Ty Lee. As she rode closer, he realized she had a nude woman draped across her tall bay in front of the saddle. A woman bound at ankles and knees, wrists and elbows. Her long golden hair almost brushed the ground, and there were jeweled necklaces and ropes of pearls caught in it. A strand of large green stones and gold slid free and fell to the dirt as Ty Lee reined in. Removing her peculiar helmet with gauntleted hands, she rested it on the woman's upturned bottom. "A remarkable weapon, those bows of yours," she drawled, eyeing the Two Rivers men. "I wish we had the like. Kirkland told me where to find you, my lord. They've begun surrendering. Massima's men held to the point of suicide. Most of them are dead or dying, I think. And the Damane turned that ridge into a death trap only a madman would walk into. But of all, the Suldam have already fitted Adom to over 200 women. That cold tea of yours was enough that most of them could not stand without help. I'll have to send for Tolrakan to fly them all out." Seonet made a sound in her throat. Her face was smooth, but her scent was dagger-sharp fury. She stared at Ty Lee as though trying to stare a hole through her. Ty Lee paid her no mind at all, except to shake her head slightly. "After my people and I are gone," Perrin said. His agreement was with her. He did not want to risk testing it with anyone else. "What are our losses aside from Massima's men?" "Light," Ty Lee replied. "Between your archers and the Damani, they never really managed to close with us. I've never seen a battle plan come off so smoothly. If we have 100 dead between us, I'll be surprised." Perrin winced. He supposed those were light casualties under the circumstances, but some would be Two Rivers men. Whether or not he knew them, they were his responsibility. "Do you know where Massima is?" "With what's left of his army. He's no coward, I'll say that for him. He and his 200. Well, about 100 now. Cut a path all the way through the shadow to the ridge. Perrin ground his teeth. The man was back surrounded by his rabble. It would be his word against Massima's about why Aram had tried to kill him, and in any event, it was unlikely the man's followers would surrender him for trial. We need to start moving before the others get here. If the Shido think rescue is at hand, they might decide to forget they surrendered. Who's your prisoner? Savannah, Fael said in a cold voice. The smell of her hatred was nearly as strong as it had been while speaking of Belina. The golden-haired woman twisted herself upward, shaking hair out of her face, and losing several more necklaces in the process. Her eyes, glaring at Fael, were green fire above a strip of cloth that had been tied for a gag. She stank of rage. Savannah of the Jumai Shido. Satisfaction was strong in Tali's voice. She told me so proudly. She's no coward either. Met us wearing nothing but a silk robe and her jewels, but she managed to spear 2 of my Altarans before I took it away from her. Savannah snarled through her gag and struggled as if to throw herself from the horse, until Tali smacked her bottom anyway. After that, she contented herself with glaring at everyone in sight. She was nicely rounded, though he should not be noticing something like that with his wife there, except that Elias said she would expect him to notice, so he made himself study her openly. I claim the contents of her tent, Fael announced, shooting him a sharp look. Maybe he was not supposed to be that open. She has a huge chest of jewels in there, and I want them. Don't look at me like a loopy Perrin. We have 100,000 people to feed, clothe, and help get back to their homes. 100,000 at least. I want to come with you, my lady, if you'll have me, the young fellow who had been holding Magdalene piped up. I won't be the only one, if you'll have us. Your lady wife, I presume, my lord? Tali said, eyeing Fael. She is. Fael allowed me to present Banner General Tali Kirgan in service to the Empress of Shonchan. Perhaps he was acquiring some of that polish himself. Banner General, my wife, Lady Fael Ni Bashir Tebara. Tali bowed in her saddle. Fael made a small curtsy, inclined her head slightly. Dirty face or no dirty face, she was regal, which made him think of the broken crown. Discussion of that little matter would have to come later. No doubt it would be a prolonged discussion. He thought he might not find it so hard to raise his voice, the way she apparently wanted this time. And this is Alejandra Maritha Kigaran, Queen of Gildan, blessed of the light, defender of Garen's wall, and my liege woman. Gildan is under my protection. Cool thing to say, but it had to be said. Our agreement doesn't speak to that, my lord, Tali said carefully. I don't decide where the ever-victorious army goes. Just so you know, Banner General, and tell those above you they can't have Gildan. Alejandra smiled at him so widely, so gratefully, he almost wanted to laugh. Light Fael was smiling too, a proud smile. He rubbed the side of his nose. We really do need to begin moving before those other Shido arrive. I don't want to find myself with them in front of me and all those prisoners behind me thinking about picking up a spear again. Tali chuckled. I have a little more experience with these people than you, my lord. Once they surrender, they won't fight again or try to escape for 3 days. Besides, I have some of my Altarans making bonfires out of their spears and bows just to make sure. We have time to make our deployments. My lord, I hope I never have to face you in the field, she said, pulling the steel-backed gauntlet from her right hand. I would be honored if you'd call me Tali. She bent over Savannah to offer her hand. For a moment, Perrin could only stare. It was a strange world. He had gone to her thinking he was making a deal with the Dark One. and the light knew some of what the Shon-Chen did was beyond repugnant. But the woman was stalwart and true to her word. "I'm Perrin, Ty Lee," he said, clasping her hand. "A very strange world."
Stripping off her shift, Galena tossed it down atop the silk robe and bent to pick up the riding dress she had pulled from Swift's saddlebags. The thing had been sewn for a slightly larger woman, but it would suffice until she could sell one of those fire drops. "Stand as you are, Lena," came Tharava's voice, and suddenly Galena could not have straightened if the forest around her had been on fire. She could scream, though. "Be silent." She choked as her throat swallowed the scream convulsively. She could still weep silently, and tears began to fall on the mulch of the forest floor. A hand slapped her rudely. "Somehow you have the rod," Tharava said. "You would not be out here else. Give it to me, Lena." There was no question even of resisting. Straightening, Galena dug the rod out of her saddlebags and handed it to the hawk-eyed woman, tears sliding down her cheeks. "Stop sniveling, Lena, and put on your necklace and collar. I will have to punish you for taking them off." Galena flinched. Even Tharava's command could not shut off her tears, and she knew she would be punished for that, too. Golden necklace and collar came out of the saddlebags and went on to her. She stood there wearing only her pale woolen stockings and soft white laced boots, and the weight of the fire-drop-studded collar and belt seemed enough to bear her to the ground. Her eyes fastened themselves to the white rod in Tharava's hands. "Your horse will do for a pack animal, Lena. As for you, you are forbidden to ride ever again." There had to be some way to get that rod again. There had to be. Tharava turned the thing over and over in her hands, taunting her. "Stop playing with your pet, Tharava. What are we going to do?" Belinda, a slender wise one with hair bleached almost white by the sun, strode up to glare at Tharava with pale blue eyes. She was bony, with a face well suited to glaring. That was the first Galena realized that Tharava was not alone. Several hundred men, women, and children stood among the trees behind them, some of the men carrying women slung over their shoulders, of all things. She covered herself with her hands, her face heating. Those long days of enforced nakedness had not inured her to being unclothed in front of men. Then she noticed another oddity. Only a handful were Algaidasiswai, with bow cases on their backs and quivers at their hips. But every man and every woman except the wise ones among them was carrying at least one spear. They had their faces veiled, too, with a scarf or just a scrap of cloth. What could it mean? "We are returning to the Threefold Land," Tharava said. "We will send runners to find every sept that can be found and tell them to abandon their Wetlander Gaishine, abandon everything they must, and make their way by stealth back to the Threefold Land. We will rebuild our clan. The Shido will rise from the disaster Savannah led us to." "That will take generations," Modara protested. Slim and quite pretty, but even taller than Tharava, as tall as most Aiel men, she stood up to Tharava unflinchingly. Galena could not understand how she did that. The woman made her flinch with a glance. "Then we will take generations," Tharava said firmly. "We will take whatever time is necessary, and we will never leave the Threefold Land again." Her gaze shifted to Galena, who flinched. "You will never touch this again," she said, raising the rod briefly. "And you will never try to escape me again. She has a strong back. Load her, and let us be on our way. They may try to pursue us." Burdened with water skins and pots and kettles, till she almost felt decently covered, Galena staggered through the forest at Tharava's heels. She did not think of the rod or escape. Something had broken in her. She was Galena Kazdan, highest of the Red Ajah, who sat on the Supreme Council of the Black Ajah, and she was going to be Tharava's plaything for the rest of her life. She was Tharava's little Lena. For the rest of her life. She knew that to her bones. Tears rolled silently down her face. Chapter 31. the house on Full Moon Street. They must stay together, Elaine said firmly. The two of you shouldn't be out by yourselves, for that matter. Always 3 or 4 together, anywhere in Camelin. That's the only way to be safe. Just 2 of the mirrored stand lamps were lit, 6 flames filling the sitting room with a dim light and the scent of lilies. So much of the lamp oil had gone bad that it was always perfumed now. But a crackling fire on the hearth was beginning to take away some of the early hours' coolness. There are times a woman wants a little privacy, Sumiko replied calmly, as if yet another kinswoman had not just died from wanting privacy. Her voice was calm, at least, but plump hands smoothed her dark blue skirts. If you won't put the fear of the light into them, Sumiko, I will, Elise said, her usually mild face stern. She looked the elder of the two, with touches of gray in her hair, compared to the glossy black hair that fell below Sumiko's stout shoulders. Yet she was the younger by better than 200 years. Elise had been intrepid when Ebudar fell and they were forced to flee the Shanshan, but her hands moved on her brown skirts too. It was long past the bedtime that Asanda's niece Melfane had decreed, but tired as she was all the time, once Elaine woke, she could never get back to sleep. And warm goat's milk did not help. Warm goat's milk tasted worse than cool. She was going to make Rand Bloody Althor drink warm bloody goat's milk till it came out of his ears. Right after she found out what had hurt him badly enough that she sensed the small jolt of pain, while everything else in that small knot in the back of her head that was him remained as vague as a stone. It had been all a stone again ever since, so he was all right, yet something had hurt him deeply for her to sense anything at all. And why was he traveling so often? One day he was far to the southeast, the next to the northwest and even more distant. The day after that somewhere else. Was he running from whoever had hurt him? But she had her own worries at the moment. Unable to sleep and restless, she had dressed herself in the first thing that came to hand, a dark gray riding dress, and gone for a walk to enjoy the stillness of the palace in the small hours of the morning, when even the servants were abed and flickering stand lamps were the only things that moved in the hallways aside from her. Her and her bodyguards, but she was learning to ignore their presence. She did enjoy the solitude until the 2 women encountered her and delivered the sad news that would have awaited sunrise otherwise. She had brought them back to her smaller sitting room to discuss the matter behind a ward against listeners. Sumiko shifted her bulk in her armchair to glare at Elise. Rihanna lets you press boundaries, but as eldest, I expect— You're not eldest, Sumiko, the smaller woman said coolly. You have the authority here, but by the rule, the knitting circle consists of the 13 eldest of us in Ebudar. We aren't in Ebudar any longer, so there is no knitting circle. Sumiko's round face grew hard as granite. At least you admit I have the authority. And I expect you to use it to prevent any more of us being murdered. Suggesting isn't enough, Sumiko. No matter how strongly you say you suggest, it isn't enough. Arguing will get us nowhere, Elaine said. I know you're on edge. I am too. Light, 3 women murdered with the one power in the last 10 days, and very likely 7 more before that, were enough to put an anvil on edge. But snapping at each other is the worst thing we can do. Sumiko, you need to put your foot down. I don't care how much anyone wants privacy. No one can be by herself for a minute. Elise, use your persuasion. Persuasion was not exactly the word. Elise did not persuade. She simply expected people to do as she said, and they nearly always did. Convince the others that Sumiko is right. Between the 2 of you, you have to— The door opened to admit Denny, who closed it again behind her and bowed, one hand on her sword hilt, the other on her long cudgel. The red lacquered breastplates and helmets, trimmed in white, had been delivered only yesterday, and the stocky woman had been smiling ever since she donned hers. But she looked solemn behind the face bars now. Pardon for interrupting, my lady, but there's an Aes Sedai here demanding to see you. A red by her shawl. I told her you were likely sleeping, but she was ready to come in and wake you herself. A red. There were reports of reds in the city from time to time, though not so often as once. Most Aes Sedai in the city went without their shawls, concealing their ajas. Yet what would a red want with her? Surely they all knew by now that she stood with Egwene and against Elida. Unless someone was finally trying to bring her to book for the bargain with the sea folk. Tell her that I'm... The door opened again, bumping Denny's back, pushing her out of the way. The woman who entered, vine-woven shawl draped along her arms so the long red fringe displayed itself to advantage, was tall and slim and copper-skinned. She would have been pretty, except that her mouth was compressed until her full lips seemed thin. Her riding dress was so dark it might have been black, but the pale light of the stand mirrors picked up hints of red, and the divided skirts were slashed with brighter red. Juhara Basaheen never made any secret of her Aja. Once Sumiko and Elise would have been on their feet and curtsying for an Aes Sedai in a flash, but now they remained seated, studying her. Denny, normally placid, in appearance at least, scowled and fingered her cudgel. I see the tales of you gathering wilders are true, Juhara said. A great pity, that. The two of you get out. I wish to speak with Elaine privately. If you're wise, you will leave tonight, heading in different directions, and tell any others like you to do the same. The White Tower looks amiss on wilders gathering together. When the tower looks on something amiss, thrones have been known to tremble. Neither Sumiko nor Elise moved. Elise actually arched an eyebrow. They can stay, Elaine said coldly. With the power in her, her emotions were not bouncing. They were steady in an icy anger. They are welcome here. You, on the other hand, Elida tried to have me kidnapped, Juhara. Kidnapped. You can leave. A poor welcome, Elaine, when I came to the palace as soon as I arrived, and after a journey that would be as torturous to describe as it was to endure. Andor has always had good relations with the Tower. The Tower intends to see they remain good. Are you sure you want these wilders to hear everything I have to say to you? Very well, if you insist. Gliding to one of the carved sideboards, she wrinkled her nose at the silver pitcher holding goat's milk and poured herself a cup of dark wine before taking a chair across from Elaine. Denny made a move as if to try dragging her out, but Elaine shook her head. The Damani sister ignored the kinswomen as if they had ceased to exist. The woman who drugged you has been punished, Elaine. She was flogged in front of her own shop with everyone in her village watching. Juhara sipped her wine, waiting for Elaine to respond. She said nothing. She knew very well that Rhonda Makura had been flogged for failure rather than for feeding her that vile tea, but saying so would make Juhara wonder how she knew, and that might lead to things that needed to remain hidden. The silence stretched, and finally the other woman went on. You must know that the White Tower wants very much for you to mount the Lion Throne. To achieve that end, Elida has sent me to be your advisor. In spite of herself, Elaine laughed. Elida had sent her an advisor? It was ludicrous. I have Aes Sedai to advise me when I need advice, Juhara. You must know I oppose Elida. I wouldn't accept a pair of stockings from that woman. Your so-called advisors are rebels, child, Juhara said chidingly, with a heavy dose of distaste on the word rebels. She gestured with the silver wine cup. Why do you think you have so many houses opposing you, so many standing aside? They surely know you don't really have the backing of the Tower. With me as your advisor, that changes. I might be able to put the crown on your head inside a week. At most, it should take no more than a month or two. Elaine met the other woman's gaze with a level gaze of her own. Her hands wanted to make fists, but she kept them still in her lap. Even were that so, I'd refuse you. I expect to hear any day that Elida has been deposed. The White Tower will be whole again, and no one will be able to claim I lack its backing then. Juhara studied her wine for a moment, her face a mask of Aes Sedai serenity. It won't be entirely smooth going for you, she said, as if Elaine had not spoken. This is the part I thought you wouldn't want the Wilders to hear, and that guard. Does she think I'm going to attack you? No matter. Once you have the crown firmly on your head, you will have to appoint a regent, because you must return to the Tower then to complete your training and eventually be tested for the shawl. You need have no fear of being birched as a runaway. Elida accepts that Swan Sanche ordered you to leave the tower. Your pretense of being Aes Sedai is another matter. That you will pay for with tears. Sumiko and Elise stirred, and Yuhara took notice of them again. Ah, you didn't know that Elaine is really only one of the accepted? Elaine rose and stared down at Yuhara. Usually someone seated held the advantage over someone standing, but she made her stare hard and her voice harder. She wanted to slap the woman's face. I was raised Aes Sedai by Egwene Alvear on the day she herself was raised Amyrlin. I chose the Green Aja and was admitted. Don't you ever say I'm not Aes Sedai, Juhara. Burn me if I'll stand still for it. Juhara's mouth pinched down till her lips seemed a gash. Think, and you will see the reality of your situation, she said finally. Think hard, Elaine. A blind woman could see how much you need me and the White Tower's blessing. We will talk again later. Have someone show me to my rooms. I am more than ready for my bed. You'll have to find a room at an inn, Juhara. Every bed in the palace already has 3 or 4 people sleeping in it. If dozens of beds had been free, she would not have offered Juhara one. Turning her back, she walked to the fireplace and stood warming her hands. The gilded pendulum clock on the scroll-carved marble mantel chimed 3 times. Perhaps as many hours remained till sunrise. Denny, have someone escort Juhara to the gates. You won't fend me off so easily, child. No one fends off the White Tower easily. Think, and you'll see I'm your only hope. Silk whisked against silk as she left the room, and the door clicked shut behind her. It seemed very possible Juhara would cause trouble trying to make herself needed, but one problem at a time. Did she put doubts in your minds? Elaine said, turning from the fire. None, Sumiko replied. Vandene and the other 2 accept you as Aes Sedai, so you must be. Conviction was strong in her voice, but then she had reason to want to believe. If Elaine were a liar, her dreams of returning to the tower, of joining the Yellow Aja, died. But this Juhara believed she was speaking the truth. Elise spread her hands. I'm not saying I doubt you. I don't. But the woman believes. Elaine sighed. The situation is complicated. That was like saying water was moist. I am Aes Sedai, but Juhara doesn't believe. She can't, because that would be admitting Egwene Alvear truly is the Amyrlin seat. And Juhara won't do that until Elida has been brought down. She hoped Juhara would believe then. Accept, at least. The tower had to be made whole. Sumiko, you will order the kinswoman to stay in groups, always? The stout woman muttered that she would. Unlike Rihanna, Sumiko had no flair for leadership, or liking for it either. A pity no older kinswoman had appeared to take the burden from her. Elise, you'll make sure they obey? Elise's agreement was firm and quick. She would have been the perfect candidate if the kin did not determine their rankings by age. Then we've done what we can. It's long past time you were in your beds. Long past time for you, too, Elise said as she stood. I could send for Melfane? No need to rob her of sleep, too, Elaine said hastily and firmly. Melfane was short and stout, a merry woman with a ready laugh, and unlike her aunt in other ways as well. Merry or not, the midwife was a tyrant who would not be pleased to learn that she was awake. I'll sleep when I can. Once they left, she released Saidar and took up a book from several on the second sideboard, yet another history of Andor, but she could not concentrate. Bereft of the tower, she felt grumpy. Burn her, she was so weary that her eyes felt grainy. She knew that if she lay down, though, she would stare at the ceiling until the sun rose. In any case, she had stared at the page for only minutes when Denny appeared again. Master Nori is here, my lady, with that Hark fellow. Said he'd heard you were up and wondered if you could spare him a few minutes. He had heard she was up? If he was having her watched? The import broke through her grumpiness. Hark. He had not brought Hark since that first visit 10 days ago. No, 11 days now. Ebullience replaced peevishness. Telling Denny to send them in, she followed the woman as far as the anteroom, where a patterned carpet covered most of the red and white floor tiles. Here, too, only a pair of stand lamps were lit, giving off a dim, wavering light and a scent of roses. Master Nari looked more than ever a white-crested wading bird with his long, spindly shanks and tufts of hair sticking up behind his ears. But for once, he almost seemed excited. He was actually rubbing his hands together. He was not carrying his leather folder tonight. Even in the dim light, the ink stains on his crimson tabard showed. One had turned the tuft of the white lion's tail black. He offered a stiff bow, and the nondescript Hark imitated him awkwardly, then knuckled his forehead for good measure. He was wearing a darker brown than he had previously, but the same belt and buckle. "Forgive the hour, my lady," Nari began in that dry voice. "How did you know I was awake?" she demanded, emotions bouncing again. Nori blinked, startled by the question. "One of the cooks mentioned sending up warm goat's milk for you when I went to get some for myself, my lady. I find warm goat's milk very soothing when I can't sleep. But she mentioned wine, too, so I assumed you had visitors and might still be awake." Elaine sniffed. She still wanted to snap at someone. Keeping that out of her voice required an effort. "I suppose you've success to report, Master Hark?" "I followed him, like you said, my lady, and he's been to the same house 3 nights, counting this one. It's on Full Moon Street in the new city it is. Only place he ever goes, except taverns and common rooms. He drinks some, he does. Dices a lot, too." The man hesitated, dry washing his hands nervously. "I can go now, right, my lady? You'll take off whatever it was you put on me?" "According to the tax rolls," Nori said, "the house is owned by the Lady Cheyenne of Arhind, my lady. She seems to be the last of the house." "What else can you tell me about the place, Master Hark? Who else lives there besides this Lady Cheyenne?" Hark rubbed his nose uneasily. "Well, I don't know as they live there, my lady, but there's 2 Aes Sedai there tonight. I saw one of them letting Melar out while the other was coming in. And the one who was coming in said, 'A pity there are only 2 of us, Phalian, the way Lady Cheyenne works us.' Only she said lady like she didn't mean it, she did. Honey, she was carrying a stray cat, a thing scrawny as she was." He bobbed a sudden nervous bow. "Begging your pardon, my lady. Didn't mean no offense, speaking of an Aes Sedai that way, but it took me a minute to realize she was Aes Sedai, it did. There was good light from the entry hall, there was, but she was so thin and plain with a wide nose that nobody would take her for Aes Sedai without some study." Elaine laid a hand on his arm. Excitement bubbled in her voice, and she let it. "What were their accents?" "Their accents, my lady? Well, the one with the cat, she's from right here in Camelin, I'd say. The other, well, she didn't say above 2 sentences, but I'd say she was Kandori. Called the other Marilyn, if that helps, my lady." Laughing, Elaine capered a few steps. She knew who had set Melar on her now, and it was worse than she had feared. Marilyn Germalfin and Phalian Boda, 2 black sisters who had fled the tower after doing murder. That had been to facilitate theft, but it was the murders that would see them stilled and beheaded. It had been to find them and the others with them that she, Egwene, and Nynaeve had been sent out of the tower. The Black Aja had planted Melar next to her, to spy most likely, but still a chilling thought. Worse than she had feared, and yet finding the 2 now was like completing the circle. Hark was staring at her with his mouth hanging open, she realized. Master Nori was studiously examining the lion's stained tail. She stopped dancing and folded her hands. Fool men. "Where is Melar now?" "In his rooms, I believe," Nori said. "My lady, you'll take it off now," Hark said, "and I can go. I did what you asked." "First you have to lead us to this house," she said, darting past him to the twinned doors. "Then we'll talk." Putting her head out into the corridor, she found Denny and 7 more guardswomen lined up on either side of the doors. "Denny, send someone to fetch the Lady Birgitta as fast as possible, and someone else to wake the Aes Sedai and ask them to come too, with their warders, and prepare to take a ride. Then you go and wake however many guardswomen you think you need to arrest Melar. You needn't be too gentle about it. The charges are murder and being a dark friend. Lock him in one of the basement storerooms with a strong guard. The stocky woman smiled broadly and began giving orders as Elaine went back inside. Hark was wringing his hands and shifting from one foot to the other anxiously. My lady, what do you mean, real talk? You promised to take this thing off me if I followed the man, you did. And I did, so you have to keep your word. I never said I'd remove the finder, Master Hark. I said you'd be exiled to Baerlon instead of hanging, but wouldn't you rather remain in Camelin? The man widened his eyes, trying to look sincere, and failing. He even smiled. Oh, no, my lady. I've been dreaming about the fresh country air in Baerlon, I has. I'll wager there's never a worry about getting rotten meat in your stew there. Here, you got to sniff careful before you eat anything. I'm looking forward to it, I am. Elaine put on the stern face her mother had always worn, passing judgment. You'd be out of Baerlon 2 minutes behind the guardsman who escorted you there. And then you'd hang for breaking your exile. Much better for you to remain in Camelin and take on a new line of work. Master Nori, could you use a man with Hark's talents? I could, my lady, Nori replied, without even a pause for thought. A satisfied smile touched his thin lips, and Elaine realized what she had done. She had given him a tool to encroach on Mistress Harfor's ground, but there was no undoing it now. The work won't be so remunerative as your former trade, Master Hark, but you won't hang for it. So what, my lady? Hark said, scratching his head. It won't pay so well. What do you say? Baerlon, where you'll surely cut a purse or bolt and hang for either one? Or Camelin, where you'll have steady work and no fear of the hangman, unless you take up cutting purses again. Hark swayed on his feet, scrubbing the back of his hand across his mouth. I needs a drink, I does, he muttered hoarsely. Very likely he believed the finder would allow her to know if he cut a purse. If so, she had no intention of disabusing him. Master Nori scowled at the man, but when he opened his mouth, she said, There's wine in the small sitting room. Let him have 1 cup, then join me in the large sitting room. The large sitting room was dark when she walked in, but she channeled to light the mirrored stand lamps against the dark paneled walls, and the kindling of the fires neatly laid on the facing hearths. Then she took a seat in one of the low-backed chairs around the scroll-edged table, and released Saidar again. Since her experiment at holding the power all day, she had not held it longer than necessary. Her mood swung from joyful excitement to morose worry and back. On the one hand, she was done with having to put up with Mellar, and soon she would have her hands on 2 black sisters. Questioning them might lead to the rest, or at least reveal their plans. And if not, this Cheyenne would have her own secrets. Anyone who was working 2 Darkfriend sisters would have secrets worth knowing. On the other hand, what would Duhara do to try forcing her acceptance as an advisor? Duhara would try to meddle somehow, but she could not see how. Burn her? She did not need any more difficulties between her and the throne. With a little luck, tonight would not only snare 2 black sisters, it might uncover a 3rd, a murderer 10 times over. Back and forth she went, from Phalion and Marilyn to Duhara, even after Master Nori and Hark joined her. Hark, a silver cup in his hand, tried to take a seat at the table, but Master Nori tapped him on the shoulder and jerked his head toward a corner. Sullenly, Hark went where he was directed. He must have begun drinking as soon as the cup was filled, because he emptied it in one long pull, then stood turning it over in his hands and staring at it. Suddenly he gave a start and directed an ingratiating grin at her. Whatever he saw in her face made him flinch. Scuttling to the long table against the wall, he set the cup down with exaggerated care, then scuttled back to his corner. Birgitta was the first to arrive, the bond filled with weary discontent. A ride, she said, and when Elaine explained, she began raising objections. Well, some of it was objections. The rest was just insults. What hair-brained, crack-pated scheme are you talking about, Birgitta? Van Dien said as she entered the room. She wore a riding dress that hung loose on her. One of her sisters, it would have fit her perfectly while Adelius was alive, but the white-haired woman had lost weight. Her Jaime, wiry and gnarled, took one look at Hark and placed himself where he could watch the man. Hark ventured a smile, but it faded when Jaime's expression remained hard as iron. The warder's graying hair was thin, but there was nothing soft about him. She intends to try capturing 2 black sisters tonight, Birgitta replied, shooting a hard look at Elaine. 2 black sisters? Sarita exclaimed, walking through the door. She gathered her dark cloak around her as though the words had given a chill. Who? Her warder Ned, a tall, broad-shouldered young man with yellow hair, eyed Hark and touched his sword hilt. He chose a spot where he could watch the man, too. Hark shifted his feet. He might have been thinking of trying to run. Phalian Boda and Marilyn Gamalfin, Elaine said. Sarita's mouth hardened. What about Phalian and Marilyn? Cariana asked as she glided into the room. Her warders were disparate men, a tall, gangly Tyran, a blade-slender Saldaean, and a broad-shouldered Kyrianan. They exchanged glances, and Taven, the Kyrianan, leaned against the wall watching Hark, while Sierra and Venner stood in the doorway. Hark's mouth took on a sickly twist. There was nothing for it but to explain again from the beginning, which Elaine did with a rising impatience that had nothing to do with her shifting moods. The longer this took, the more chance that Phalian and Marilyn might be gone by the time she reached the house on Full Moon Street. She wanted them. She intended to have them. She should have made Birgitta wait until everyone had gathered. A good plan, I think, Vandine said when she finished. Yes, it will do nicely. Others were not so agreeable. It isn't a plan, it's bloody madness, Birgitta said sharply. Arms folded beneath her bosom, she scowled down at Elaine, the bond such a turmoil of emotions that Elaine could barely make them out. The 4 of you enter the house alone. Alone? That isn't a plan. It's flaming insanity. Warders are supposed to guard their Aes Sedai's backs. Let us come with you. The other warders put in emphatic agreements, but at least she was not trying to stop the whole thing anymore. There are 4 of us, Elaine told her. We can watch our own backs, and sisters do not ask their warders to face other sisters. Birgitta's face darkened. If I need you, I'll shout so loud you'll be able to hear me if you were back here in the palace. The warders remain outside, she added when Birgitta opened her mouth. The bond filled with frustration, but Birgitta's jaw snapped shut. Perhaps this man can be trusted, Sarita said, glancing at Hark with no trust at all. But even if he heard correctly, nothing says there are still only 2 sisters in the house, or any. If they have gone, there's no danger, but if others have joined them, we might as well put our necks in a noose and spring the trap ourselves. Cariana folded her sturdy arms and nodded. The danger is too great. You yourself told us that when they fled the tower, they stole a number of ter'angreal, some very dangerous indeed. I've never been called a coward, but I don't fancy trying to sneak up on someone who might have a rod that can make balefire. He could hardly have misheard something as simple as, there are only 2 of us, Elaine replied firmly. And they spoke as if they didn't expect any others. Burn her? Considering her standing with respect to them, they should have been jumping to obey rather than arguing. In any case, this isn't a discussion. A pity both objected. If only one had, it could have been a clue. Unless they both were Black Ajah. A bone-freezing thought, that. Yet her plan took the possibility into account. Phalian and Marilyn won't know we are coming until it's too late. If they're gone, we'll arrest this Cheyenne, but we are going. It was a larger party than Elaine had expected that rode out of the Queen's stable yard behind her and Hark. Birgitta had insisted on bringing 50 guardswomen, though all they would be doing was missing 3. A column of 2s in red-lacquered helmets and breastplates, black in the night, that snaked along the palace behind the Aes Sedai and warders. Reaching the front of the palace, they skirted the edge of the Queen's Plaza, the great oval crowded now with rude shelters that housed sleeping guardsmen and nobles' armsmen. Men were billeted everywhere room could be found, but there were insufficient basements and attics and spare rooms near enough the palace, and the parks where circles of kinswomen would take the men to the places where they were needed. The fighting they did was afoot, on the walls, so their horses were all picketed in nearby parks and in the larger palace gardens. A few sentries shifted as they passed, heads swiveling to follow, but with her hood up, all they could be sure of was that a large contingent of guardswomen were escorting a party through the night. The sky to the east was still dark, but it must be less than 2 hours till first light. The lights and dawn would see Phalion and Marilyn in custody, and one more, at least one more. Winding streets led over and around the hills, past narrow, tile-covered towers that would glitter with 100 colors when the sun rose, and glittered faintly in the cloud-dappled moonlight. Past silent shops and lightless inns, simple stone houses with slate roofs, and small palaces that might have fit in Tarvalon. The ring of horseshoes on the paving stones and the faint creak of saddle leather sounded loud in the silence. Except for an occasional dog that slunk away into the deeper shadows of alleys, nothing else moved. The streets were dangerous at this hour, but no footpad would be mad enough to come in sight of so large a party. Half an hour after leaving the royal palace, Elaine rode Fireheart through the Mondel Gate, a wide 20-foot-high arch in the inner city's tall white wall. Once there would have been guardsmen on duty there to keep the peace, but the Queen's guards were spread too thin now for that. Almost as soon as they were into the new city, Harp turned east into a warren of streets that meandered in every direction through the city's hills. He rode awkwardly on a bay mare that had been found for him. Cut-purses seldom spent time in the saddle. Some of the streets were quite narrow here, and it was in one of those that he finally drew rein, surrounded by stone houses of 2 or 3 or even 4 stories. Birgitta raised a hand to halt the column. The sudden silence seemed deafening. "It's just around that corner there, it is, my lady, the other side of the street," Harp said in a near whisper. "But if we go riding out there, they might hear us or see us. Pardon, my lady, but if these Aes Sedai are what you says they are, I don't want them seeing me." He scrambled down from his saddle clumsily and looked up at her, wringing his hands, his moon-shadowed face anxious. Dismounting, Elaine led Fireheart to the corner and peeked around the corner of a narrow 3-story house. The houses along the other street stood dark except for one, 4 substantial stories of stone, with the closed gate of a stable yard beside it. Not an ornate building, but large enough for a wealthy merchant or banker. Bankers and merchants were unlikely to be awake at this hour, however. "There," Harp whispered hoarsely, pointing. He stood far back, so he had to lean forward to point. He really did fear being seen. "The one with the light on the 2nd floor, it is." "Best to find out if anyone else is awake in there," Van Deen said, peering past Elaine. "Jane, don't go inside the house." Elaine expected the lean old warder to sneak across the street, but he just strolled out, holding his cloak close around him against the early morning chill. Even the dangerous grace of a warder appeared to have deserted him. Van Deen seemed to sense her surprise. "Skulking draws the eye and creates suspicion," she said. "Jane is just a man walking, and if it's early to be out in the streets, he isn't sneaking. So anyone who sees him will think of some mundane reason for him to be out." Reaching the stable yard gate, Jane pulled it open and walked through as if he had a perfect right. Long minutes passed before he came back out, shutting the gate carefully behind him, and strolled back along the street. He rounded the corner, and the leopard-like grace reappeared in his step. "All the windows are dark except that one," he told Van Deen quietly. "The kitchen door is unlatched, so is the back door. That lets onto an alley. Trusting for dark friends, or else dangerous enough they don't worry about burglars. There's a big fellow sleeping in the barn up in the loft. Big enough to scare any burglar, but he's so drunk he didn't wake while I was tying him up." Van Deen raised a questioning eyebrow. "I thought I'd better be safe. Drunks sometimes wake when you least expect. You wouldn't want him seeing you go in and start making noise." She nodded approval. "It's time to get ready," Elaine said. Moving back from the corner and handing her reins to Birgitta, she tried to embrace the source. It was like trying to catch smoke with her fingers. Frustration and anger welled up, all the things you needed to suppress if you were to channel. She tried again and failed again. Phalion and Marilyn were going to get away, to come this close. They had to be in that lighted room. She knew it, and they were going to escape. Sadness replaced anger, and suddenly Saidar flowed into her. She barely stifled a sigh of relief. I'll meld the flows, Sarita. Vandine, you meld for Cariana. I don't understand why we have to link, the Tyron Brown muttered, but she put herself on the edge of embracing the power. With 2 of them and 4 of us, we outnumber them, but linked it's 2 and 2. A clue? Perhaps she wished it to be 3 and 3? 2 strong enough to overwhelm them, even if they're holding the power, Sarita. Elaine reached through her as if she were an Angreal, and the glow of Saidar surrounded the other woman as the link was completed. In truth, it surrounded both of them, but she could only see the part around Sarita, until she wove spirit around her. Then the glow vanished. She placed the same weave on herself and prepared 4 shields and several other weaves, all inverted. She felt almost giddy with excitement, but she did not intend to be caught by surprise. Frustration still pulsed along the bond, but for the rest, Birgitta felt like a drawn arrow. Elaine touched her arm. We will be all right. Birgitta snorted and flung her thick braid back over her shoulder. Keep an eye on Master Hark, Birgitta. It would be a shame if he had to be hanged because he was tempted to run. Hark squeaked. She exchanged glances with Vandine, who said, We might as well be about it. The 4 of them walked up Full Moon Street slowly, as if out for a stroll, and slipped into the shadow-shrouded stable yard. Elaine opened the kitchen door slowly, but the hinges were well oiled, emitting not a squeak. The brick-walled kitchen was lit only by a tiny fire in the wide stone fireplace where a kettle hung steaming. Yet that was enough for them to cross the floor without bumping into the table or chairs. Someone sighed, and she pressed a warning finger to her lips. Vandine frowned at Cariana, who looked embarrassed and spread her hands. A short hall led to stairs at the front of the house. Gathering her skirts, Elaine started up, silent on slippered feet. She was careful to keep Sarita where she could see her. Vandine was doing the same with Cariana. They could do nothing with the power, but that hardly meant they could do nothing. On the second flight of stairs, she began hearing the murmur of voices. Light spilled from an open door. Don't care what you think, a woman said in that room. You leave the thinking to me and do as you're told. Elaine moved to the door. It was a sitting room with gilded stand lamps and rich carpet on the floor and a tall fireplace of blue marble, but she had eyes.
Alright, everyone, gonna call into this live for tonight. I want to thank everyone that stops by, everyone that continues to stop by. Definitely appreciate all y'all support. Until next time, everyone. Y'all stay safe out there.
This might answer your question. Cannabis, also known